Hello everyone, welcome back. It's another episode of Spectator Sports. I'm your host Sebastian Fonseca. Happy holidays, Merry Christmas to those who celebrated. And before we get into breaking down the NBA slate of Christmas Day games and also big matchups across the NFL, let's do a little bit of housekeeping. If you're new to the channel, please like this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. It makes a massive difference. It takes 2 seconds and we're this close to hitting our 100 subscriber goal by the end of the year. Please help us with that. And then for the clips, you can get that in our playlist on YouTube, and you can get it on other platforms like TikTok and Instagram. Links are in the description, and you can get the audio from this podcast on Spotify. All links are in the description. For the better part of my following of various sports, especially the NFL, the Detroit Lions have always been at the bottom of the league. I mean, I experienced the 2008 0-16 season. We have seen the rise and fall of Matthew Stafford's edition of the Detroit Lions, and now this reset. I mean, 3-13. We had the 1-6 start, barely missing the playoffs, but now the Detroit Lions have clinched the NFC North. The last time they did so, I wasn't even born. It was 30 years ago. And in 1993, the NFC North didn't even exist. It was the NFC Central Division at that point. Fewer teams, but the landscape was much different back then. But to talk about this transition, it has to start off, of course, with Dan Campbell changing the culture. He had an interesting introductory press conference, and I mean, it was a little outside the box, and we weren't really sure what his message was. It was interesting. But after 3 years, I think a lot of these things, what he's trying to say, that message is finally getting across. Of course, it helps with the GM supplying talent, them improving, hitting on their draft picks as well. And now they really have changed the culture in Detroit. I mean, taking full advantage of Aaron Rodgers' departure after dominating that division for the better part of 15 years. And the Minnesota Vikings kind of fall because of the Kirk Cousins injury. And of course, Chicago's just general ineptitude. Nonetheless, let's give some credit to Detroit. After all of these things, especially winning on the road when they have 3 chances to get this done, and you want to nip it in the bud, you want to get this thing addressed ASAP. They did so. I mean, going up against the Minnesota Vikings, who are still alive for the NFC North title to defend their title from last year, they had to win out and hope Detroit loses out. Well, Detroit didn't leave them any room for error, because on the opening drive, went right down the field, opening drive touchdown. That was the first opening drive touchdown in about 9 games. And I mean, Brian Flores is always going to be one of those great defensive coordinators, and what he's doing with the personnel he's working with, they were on this streak where they were one of the best defenses in terms of containing opponents to just 16.3 points a game in 9 games. That just means this guy knows defense. He's off the Belichick coaching tree. He didn't have the best shakedown in Miami, but I think as just a pure DC, he knows what to do. And what he's done in Minnesota has been tremendous to keeping them in the playoff mix despite all this overhaul of the quarterback position. But in the first half, you could see that Detroit really just has a leg up, because not only is their defense kind of containing it due to the Nick Mullins turnovers, but their offense was really tearing up that defense for Minnesota. I mean, they had chances late, and it made it an interesting ball game at 30-24. But Detroit is just too good right now. I like what Minnesota has done just to get to this point, but and you're on your 4th starting quarterback. I mean, unless you're what the Cleveland Browns are, who we'll talk about a little bit later in this podcast, they just don't have enough around them to survive that, especially such a devastating injury like the Kirk Cousins case. Detroit has a lot of speed. We saw Jahmyr Gibbs have that excellent type of game that he's been consistently doing throughout the season. David Montgomery is the strong in between the tackles type of back. You have Jamison Williams, you have Sam Laporta, so many weapons, and Ben Johnson, who's been such a diverse, great play caller for the Detroit Lions, is going to get a head coaching gig, let's be honest. What Detroit's going to be able to do, I'm still not sure yet. But if they beat Dallas on the road next week in a very pivotal matchup for both teams, because Detroit is still very much alive for that 2 seed, I think despite some of their hiccups along the way, I mean, Detroit really looks like they could be a big-time player in the NFC playoffs. The Miami Dolphins beat the Dallas Cowboys in a thriller. I mean, this was a matchup of 2 pretenders that we weren't really sure what their ceilings were, because they're great at beating the lower-level competitions, teams below 500. They're great. But when they play those above 500 teams, they haven't really stood up to the level of competitions. Dallas has had just 1 win over a team above 500, and Miami has just failed to meet that standard that they're trying to put out, that they're changed, and Tua is an elite quarterback who is being a guy that can be reliable, and he's, I think, figured out that he is definitely more consistent health-wise, but in a lot of those big games, he hasn't come up in the best and brightest spots. But in this game, Miami did just enough plays, and we're going to talk about how Dallas has been sloppy in pivotal matchups and pivotal moments of this game and cost them this result. With Dallas dropping this game, I mean, now that's 2 in a row, both on the road, both against 2 very tough AFC East opponents, and now you're reeling heading into the last 2 weeks. You have Detroit coming in. This basically would cost you a chance to win the NFC East, with Philadelphia slumping for 3 games in a row, including you beating Philadelphia. That is a tremendous opportunity. Despite the early season struggles, you have a chance to win this division, host a home playoff game, and they've been undefeated for the better part of the last 18 months, but in this circumstance, they're looking like they're going to have to play on the road. The way that they play on the road is entirely different to what they do at home. They're a fast team, but when they go out on the road, especially in inclement weather, that brings out little kinks in their armor where they're not as fast, they're not as physical, they don't have the turf to rely on, so their traction is compensated as well. I know they'll probably be slated to play a team like the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who can absolutely have like a rainy playoff game like we saw before, but it's just something to keep an eye out for. And then they have to travel probably to Philadelphia later, and I know Philadelphia hasn't looked that great, but the weather is certainly a factor when they're playing Dallas. For Dallas, Dak played winning football. I mean, him and CD were great in that first quarter, great at the end, but there were some key situations where they just didn't meet that standard, and that comes back to Mike McCarthy. Since Mike McCarthy has taken over the Dallas Cowboys have been one of the most penalized teams in the NFL, and we've known that Mike McCarthy is a little bit lax and has issues managing clock as well. I think of that last drive where they had the go-ahead touchdown drive, which is great. Take the lead. Absolutely should do so. There was an opportunity, I think, to score faster. It was a little bit at the wrong point to go long, methodical drive, because anything inside of 5 minutes, that's very unlikely, especially in the fourth quarter, that you will see the ball again. I know Dallas's defense was great for the most part. They held Miami's offense in check, forcing them to take field goals rather than scoring touchdowns, and they got a nice sack to give them a chance to win the game, which they took advantage of. But when you're just defending a field goal and you cannot allow you in a field goal to prevent you from losing this game, that's a big ask. No matter who the defense are, the rules disfavor offenses to move the ball. And on that possession, you had that face mask penalty. That was a medium type of game, but that moved the ball beyond the 40-yard line. And then at that point, with a kicker like Jason Sanders, the way he's kicking the ball at that time, he just needs maybe about 15, 20 yards and you're in his field goal range. And then you're thinking, okay, you have to get the ball back. Dallas didn't do so. They had too many opportunities to get off the field, didn't do so. Even Jeff Wilson, who was buried on the depth chart for Miami, finished the game off with some tough runs between the tackles. And we know that it's mostly Raheem Mostert and then Devin Achane. But Jeff Wilson has been a very good back in the NFL. And Dallas just couldn't contain that aspect. And I know they had some moments where they let Tyreek Hill, who's been compromised but still fairly effective. He got loose for a couple big games as well, and that was kind of the difference in that circumstance. For Miami, I mean, this is just probably their best win of the year. They clinch a playoff berth. They're inching this much closer to clinching the AFC East, but it's going to be a big test, I think, next week when they play Baltimore. That is the most physical team in the NFL, I think, outside of maybe the 49ers. And last year when they played a team like the 49ers, they just came up small. I think this time they'll be more up to par, but it really just depends on the weather that day. It depends on the matchup. It depends on what they can do and how they can really push this Baltimore defense, who are bullies, honestly. They are tenacious at forcing turnovers. They lead the league in sacks, and they're at least amongst the top 5 in forcing turnovers. They forced 4 on Monday Night Football against Brock Purdy, and they made him look mortal, and he's been leading the MVP race for the last 2-3 weeks. If he puts up a virtuoso, I don't know if that means he wins MVP, but that does prove that he can do so in big circumstances. He did it last time, but that was a game in September. That's a big difference to a late December game heading into January. Probably colder. It's Baltimore in December. The way the Baltimore Ravens are playing, I don't know if Miami can really sustain that, but I'm really entitled. But the way Baltimore is looking right now, I mean, they're looking like the best team in football. But if Miami can upset them and also get home field advantage, that is going to be huge for them, not only just getting into one fewer game to get to the Super Bowl, but having home field is just vital, I think, for Miami to get them to the Super Bowl. The NBA's Christmas Day slate of games was interesting and very exciting. I think the Knicks and Bucks, that's a rematch because these two teams have played 2 days before on December 23rd. It's a rematch. In that first matchup back on December 23rd, we saw the Bucks just walk into MSG and stomp all over the Knicks. It was 146 points that they scored. Giannis had what he wanted. Damian Lillard got what he wanted, but it just seemed that maybe that was a little bit too strong, and that probably forced Tom Thibodeau and the Knicks staff to really emphasize, do you want to be humiliated like this again on Christmas Day? First game in this Christmas Day slate. For a guy like Jalen Brunson, who was snubbed in the 2023 All-Star game, I think this year he's pretty much a slam dunk to make the All-Star team. But he had a virtuoso, 38 points, bunch of threes, and he is quite an anomaly. I know that this is the day and age of the 3-and-D long wing players, but there's also kind of a renaissance with those smaller guards who have that hesitation type of move to get space, and that has always been the issue with those smaller guards, is that can they make contested shots? Well, if you have a handle like Jalen Brunson, you can create space and you can get any shot that you want. And I've talked about this before, where he has superseded Julius Randle as being the number one go-to option in the Knicks pecking order. That's pretty clear. But I think the Knicks still need another piece to really ascend up the Eastern Conference, but they're still very much in that thick Eastern Conference. And for the Bucks, yeah, they dropped the game. I think they're still within arm's distance of stealing the 1 seed from the Boston Celtics. We'll see in the matchup probably later on this season. For the Bucks, it's definitely not ideal, but I do think the Bucks still have what it takes to be one of the East's best teams, and if not one of the best teams in the entire NBA. The defending champs took on the Golden State Warriors, and the Warriors have been in the epicenter of a ton of drama this year. The Draymond Green suspension now indefinitely, the Klay Thompson, will he start, will he come off the bench debacle, Andrew Wiggins now being demoted to a bench role, paving the way for Jonathan Kuminga to start. Now we're seeing a little bit of a transition from the younger Warriors supplanting the Warriors veterans. But still, the champs are still the champs. All 5 starters were in double figures. And despite Jokic having kind of a pedestrian shooting game, he got a lot of free throws. And that was the subject to the post-game press conference with Steve Kerr. And Steve was not too happy about the calls. He was talking about how the NBA's way of training officials is just allowing them, for any contact that they see, just allots to a foul. We're seeing a lot more people going to the line due to softer calls. We're seeing an accumulation of fouls, teams getting into the penalty a lot sooner, and that is simply just players manipulating the rules. And I think the officials don't really have any other options but to call fouls. It's just how they're trained, like Steve Kerr said. But there is certainly disparity. One player, especially Nikola Jokic, got 18 free throw attempts. That's a lot, but he made all 18 as well. And especially in that last stretch, I think it was the last 3 minutes of the game, it was simply just free throws from Nikola Jokic and a little bit of offense. The Nuggets outscored them 14-6, and that's really the game right there. The Nuggets know what it is now. I think they have superseded any other team to really challenge them outside of those young Timberwolves out there, but I think the Denver Nuggets really have what it takes to repeat. They missed Jamal Murray for the better part of November due to that hamstring injury, but he's back. He's looking really good. And I don't know where the standings will really lay out. They could end up not getting that top seed, but I think they could really handle a team like the Minnesota Timberwolves as long as they're healthy. I think they just have a slight issue with depth because their bench is pretty thin. But if they fire on all cylinders like they did on Christmas, I mean, MPJ can chip in 17, 18 points a game, even the occasional 20-point game. That's ideal from him. If they're getting that, I mean, the Nuggets really have a lot of firepower to contend with any team, especially in the Western Conference. I think the Timberwolves have been nice so far this year, but they haven't been a proven commodity come the playoff times. The playoffs are an entirely different animal, and I'd like to see them prove it if they were into playing the Denver Nuggets in a playoff series. Lakers Celtics, I mean, this is one of the classic rivalries of the NBA, and we got to see it on Christmas Day. The Celtics jumped all over the Lakers. I mean, it was just kind of a three-point barrage, a perimeter barrage after LeBron had one of his best games of recent memory where he was really showing off the jump shot. I mean, 5 for 5, perfect from the free throw line, something we don't really see from LeBron in his career, let alone now. But then this game kind of fell back down to earth. Maybe it's fatigue, maybe it's something else. I don't know. He wasn't at his best. Kind of a pedestrian performance from LeBron, but AD was really the guy that carried the Lakers and kept them in the ballgame with 40 points and 14 boards. But the Celtics just so deep. It wasn't even Jason Tatum's real night. He had 25 points, which is something he can get easily in his sleep. Kristaps Porzingis, I mean, that's the X factor, I think, that puts him over the top. He's not asked to be the co-star. He's not asked to even be a second option. He's the third guy. And when he's asked to do that, I think there was this really nice interview with JJ Redick on his podcast where he was talking about all the introductions to the NBA, and they're just talking, shooting the shit per se. But what he was talking about, how those expectations didn't really line up when he was traded over to Dallas, and kind of being humbled in the trade over to Washington, D.C. to play for the Wizards. It was definitely something that changed perspectives, but what Porzingis can do, that is really what you want to see out of modern bigs now, where he can stretch the floor but also defend the paint as a weak side shot blocker. And I think that's what the product that you want to see a guy like Chet Holmgren and Victor Wembanyama take as well, where they could be a little bit more what Kristaps Porzingis could be, especially from an injury and consistency standpoint. I think the biggest thing for Kristaps is just simply being available. Availability is the best ability, and if he's able to be part of this Celtics team come postseason time, I know that the Drew Holiday acquisition is great. That will lock up anybody's wing player on the opposing end. But the ability for Porzingis to be there as well, I think he's a guy that maybe won't challenge Giannis at the rim on a consistent basis, but at least he's there and that presence is there. And he can also take Giannis away from the rim when they're playing on that offensive side, and he's forced to defend him out on the perimeter, which Giannis is great as a defender, but I wouldn't say he's the best perimeter defender on that aspect. Mavs and Suns, I mean, this is kind of a historic rivalry, especially in the Western Conference. Back in the 2000s, we saw Nash and Dirk go at it countless times in giving us tantalizing postseason matchups. And this time, ever since the 2022 postseason where Luka and the Mavs upset the Phoenix Suns on the road in Game 7, even blowing them out in that one, it's kind of been a back and forth type of rivalry between Devin Booker and Luka Doncic. Now, last year it was kind of like Devin got the last laugh, especially in that regular season matchup, but it seemed now the table is turned because the Suns haven't been great coming out of the gate. I know there's injuries there. Bradley Beal hasn't been consistently there in the lineup, and same thing with Booker, same thing with KD. The Mavs didn't really have a lot of expectation, at least I didn't, because I know they have Kyrie, but outside of that, they just seem like the same old Mavs that crashed and burned and missed the play-in tournament last year. But this time they look a lot better. I mean, Luka freaking dropped 50 points, and they're doing it a lot without Kyrie. He's missed his 9th consecutive game due to a heel contusion, and obviously you want Kyrie there, but they're finding ways to win without him. And if the Mavs are doing this, I mean, I think it's very clear that they're going to be big-time players in the postseason. The Suns just need to get healthy. I mean, also KD needs to be consistent. I mean, what KD's performance was on Christmas was pathetic by his standards, at least. You know, a guy that can get 25, 30 points easy. But just didn't seem engaged, just didn't seem consistent. Luka Doncic stole the show. Out of this rivalry right now we're seeing between Devin Booker and Luka Doncic, I mean, I know Booker has had that nice little run to the finals, probably had the best postseason run between the two, but in terms of career, it's fair to say that Luka Doncic has been much better, and I'm really enticed to see what this rivalry entails moving forward. Amari Cooper has been kind of a forgotten commodity in the NFL. After being one of the best receivers for Dallas, he was traded to Cleveland, and it's been not the best start, but after probably a couple injuries and such, I think this year, especially with a little bit more consistent quarterback play with their starter for a little bit while he was there, definitely helped out his stats. But with Joe Flacco, I mean, he had a career day, a Browns franchise record, 11 catches, 265 yards, a couple TDs. And, I mean, he said it with his chest post game that he is unguardable. I think he's one of the best route runners in this game, and that's how he is simply unguardable there. And he can really make those sideline catches. But just being there, being open, finding his way open, beating zones consistently is just such a luxury to have for Joe Flacco. We remember when he was with Baltimore, he had guys like Steve Smith, although at the tail end of his career, and then also Anquan Bolden. Those are when Joe Flacco really flourished, when they had those type of receivers. I thought Joe, at least the last 4 or 5 seasons, was washed. He was a backup role, and maybe he's still a backup quarterback, but what he's doing right now with the Cleveland Browns at 10-5 on the brink of the playoffs, I mean, this is just what a story is. And this was a day the defense wasn't really consistent either. It was really the offense minus Nick Chubb, minus their starting quarterback, minus countless other parts, especially in their O-line, which is kind of their part that they lean on, especially the defense has been consistent, but now the offense is getting consistent after some turnover with countless other incompetent quarterbacks. If Joe Flacco's able to do this, lead the Browns into the postseason, and imagine them going into Baltimore, for example, that will be wild. I've always seen Joe Flacco on the other side with the Baltimore Ravens, but to go against the guy that replaced him, that will be pretty interesting to see. But I really like what the Browns are doing. I thought they would crash and burn after going to their 4th quarterback used this year, but they continue to ride defense. They continue to ride pretty decent quarterback play, at least for the last month. And what this means for the Cleveland Browns is that they have one hell of a coach in Kevin Stefanski. I mean, he had Baker Mayfield to start off, and he was able to help him out and get him back to being a pretty good quarterback. And they made the playoffs and won a playoff game on the road. They probably have to do that again to advance, but I really like what Cleveland is doing. They've been decimated at the quarterback position, but they're on the brink again of making the postseason. So I know Stefanski may not win head coach of the year, but he should get some consideration, absolutely. Let's talk about the Christmas Day slate of NFL games. And I mean, the opening matchup was kind of a snooze fest of what you thought it would be. The Las Vegas Raiders taking on the Kansas City Chiefs. The Chiefs have won 7 consecutive matchups with the Las Vegas Raiders, and I mean, you don't have Josh Jacobs. It just seems like kind of a decimated team, but it's with Antonio Pierce, who is looking like he is becoming more and more likely to be a head coaching candidate, because what he's able to do to galvanize this team, they changed so much after firing Josh McDaniels, and what they've done to replace that and change the culture in such a short amount of time, I mean, it's a testament to what Antonio Pierce is as a head coach. Former player, so he's a player's head coach, but still doing really good with this program. And the biggest thing, again, has been turnovers, and the Chiefs just are simply broken. We've tried to come up with excuse. We tried to say that it's Patrick Mahomes. They'll figure it out. It's Andy Reid. It's Travis Kelce. But let's just face it, guys. The Chiefs are broken. The dynasty is hanging on now because they're not what they used to be. This used to be a team that would be a guaranteed participant in the AFC Championship game. I mean, heck, they hosted countless AFC Championship games since 2019. I think everyone has come through Kansas City. Whether or not they win or lose, they've won several. They've been to several Super Bowls. They've won a couple as well. But this is not the same team anymore. And their defense is good, but they just got worn down in this game. And this was one hell of a day by Zamir White, the backup running back to Josh Jacobs, who was out today with an injury. Their quarterback, Aiden McConnell, barely threw the ball. He only threw it for 64 passing yards. They decided they were going to run the ball down your throat every time. As long as you can't stop us, that's what we're going to keep doing. The Chiefs offense, broken. 2 turnovers in a span of 7 seconds put the game on its head. Those defensive touchdowns were the difference in this game. I mean, a scoop and score, a pick 6, and I mean, let's talk about the celebration, the staring down Mahomes as he's entering the end zone for the score, but also heading over to the fans, and he spots a kid, obviously a Kansas City Chiefs fan, as it's a home game in Kansas City, but decides to hand it out, and then at the last minute retract the ball, and he says it's keeping. That's Jack Jones. Apparently people call him Jack, but I mean, that was very savage move, just to play a little bit of Grinch on Christmas Day. I know the kid's probably a little disappointed, but what do you honestly expect? It's your rival team in a divisional game. Do you really expect them to give the game ball from a pick 6? I don't think so. Going back to football, though, I mean, Mahomes is frustrated. Travis Kelce is frustrated. Andy Reid looks frustrated. It just seems that this Chiefs team, they may win a playoff game, sure, but they're going to be on the road most likely in the second round, either at Miami or at Baltimore. I mean, I like Patrick Mahomes in a matchup against maybe Miami, but I'm not sure against the Ravens they really stand much of a chance. They may bide time because it's Patrick Mahomes. That's the only thing I have at this point, but I told you this defense is the only thing that's good about this team, and they seem to be wearing out. They're tired. They've been on the field for a long amount of time, and this offense just doesn't have it. In the offseason, retool the entire offensive skills position side. I mean, maybe running back in terms of Isaiah Pacheco, that's pretty good, but they need wide receivers. They don't have a go-to wide receiver, and Travis Kelce isn't getting any younger either. The Ravens smothered the San Francisco 49ers, and this was a matchup of probably the 2 teams that could be ending up in the Super Bowl in Las Vegas in February. The Ravens are a tough defensive-minded team. That's always been their identity, but so are the San Francisco 49ers. These are a matchup with two bullies. The thing is that I think put San Francisco a little bit more in that driver's seat was that they have an offense that's just as physical, and that would be the Ravens' biggest test. It just seemed that they could move the ball up and down on the Ravens, especially on that opening drive, but a turnover kind of changed momentum back to Baltimore. But I was really impressed with what Lamar has been able to do. Lamar, we kind of take him for granted sometimes because he's been out for the last couple of Decembers, and that changed the Ravens seasons. But if he's able to do this, he just is able to take plays that are completely broken and run out for big gains, not just getting first downs, not just throwing the ball away. He's getting massive gains, and he's just as quick as he used to be, probably a better passer, which makes him extra dangerous. And they're doing this all without Mark Andrews. Mark Andrews has been out for 2-3 weeks, maybe a month. If they get into the playoffs deep enough, like to the AFC Championship game or even the Super Bowl, he could come back, and that's going to make this offense even more scary. I mean, Zay Flowers is killing it. Odell doing solid. Nelson Aguilar is catching the ball. That's something we haven't seen from him in a long, long time. If they're doing this to help Lamar out, I mean, we had questions about this Todd Monken offense, but they seem to be figuring things out sans Mark Andrews. And the defense is going to continue to get after it. They will force sacks. They will force turnovers. The Ravens are the best team in football. That's pretty clear after this win on Christmas Day. And for the 49ers, a missed opportunity. I think they really costed them a chance to have opportunity for rest, because if they won this game and then win next week against Washington, they can rest their starters because they clinch home field advantage. But now it kind of leaves them out to a situation where they have to win out to maintain home field advantage. But I still expect them to get that done, but definitely something where if this is tape to show how Brock Purdy is vulnerable, how to get after Brock Purdy, it's something to keep a note out for, because there weren't really accidental interception. I think they were tipped ball. That second one was certainly something to maybe say it's not entirely on Brock, but a lot of other throws were either interception-worthy plays or they did end up in interception. He threw 4 on Christmas, and that's just not enough. That is too many turnovers, and that probably cost them MVP. The Eagles finally stopped their 3-game slide. After a tough few weeks, the Eagles are back in the win column, and with some help from Dallas, they lead the NFC East by a game. Now, this could have been a blowout. This should have been a blowout. They were up 20-3 at halftime, but turnovers, penalties, things have been plaguing the Eagles, came back in that second half, and my concern is that they just cannot put teams away. They get blown out by the elite teams, and then they also cannot put the bad teams away. I haven't seen a blowout by the Eagles throughout the entire year. There's always been grind out games that they've eventually won maybe by 2 possessions on 2 occasions, but everything else has been a 1-possession game in the final score. They will need to figure out the secondary. I know they figured out maybe that Keely Ringo is better than James Bradbury at this moment, but James Bradbury is kind of all you have with Darius Slay out for the foreseeable future. They changed defensive coordinators, and I think Matt Patricia's looked better than what Sean Desai has called recently, but still some concerns. The pass rush isn't getting home, and between Tyrod Taylor leading a comeback charge, it just simply wasn't enough. But the one thing I'm really happy for is that the offense looked better. I know they had a turnover, a pick 6 by Jalen, but if you really look at that play, Dallas Goedert slipped. If he doesn't slip, that's either a catch and maybe an incompletion, but definitely not an interception, let alone a pick 6. If that's the case and they're getting this running production that we saw, 170 yards, DeAndre Swift looked like what he used to be in that early part of the season with Kenny Gainwell catching it out of the backfield, and you had an evenly distributed kind of game where it's not just Dallas, not just AJ, not just Devontae. It's other guys involved getting targets, making catches. that's kind of what you want to see out of an NFL offense. And now I think that play calling has diversified, at least for this game. I will need to see more before I get some confidence back into this team, but at least they stopped the bleeding. They have control of their own fate to win this division, and they could very well do so if Dallas loses to Detroit. All they have to do then is beat the lowly Cardinals. Heading into 2024, I think what I want to do with this podcast is have some type of wholesome content, at least one per pod. And this week, to start off the trend, is a story about Mitchell Robinson and his head coach from high school. Mitchell Robinson, he grew up in Louisiana and got very close to his high school coach, Butch Stockton. And over the year, his wife unfortunately lost her battle with cancer, and obviously that is a traumatic experience. That is something that unfortunately many people deal with, losing their spouse due to cancer. But Mitchell Robinson did something that, I mean, frankly, is probably the most heartwarming story I've heard in recent sports memory, where he took in his coach and said, "Coach, do you want to move in with me for a little bit until you get right, get your head back, because I know it's a long grieving process." And I mean, just the act of even offering that, but actually to execute that, is utterly beautiful. I mean, it's such a nice case of humanity where you do not forget those people that make such a difference in your life. I mean, he was a great part in turning Mitchell Robinson's life around. His NBA career got accelerated, his chance of being a McDonald's All-American and later getting into college and later being an NBA player, all kind of started with Butch Stockton. And as a massive thank you, in his time of need, he comes through with such a beautiful gesture, especially during the holidays. This happened a month ago and it's still happening right now, where they're basically roommates. I think it's just something that we need to really show appreciation for. He doesn't do it for fame. He doesn't do it for anybody, but just for Butch, honestly. But it's just a nice thing and honestly a beautiful act of kindness. It was something that really, I wouldn't say moved me to tears, but it just certainly warmed my heart. And for Mitchell Robinson, I salute you for doing such a kind, beautiful gesture. I want to continue this on the podcast where we recognize athletes, just acts of kindness in these kind of heartwarming moments, because we love wholesome content, especially on Spectator Sports. So that's it for this episode of Spectator Sports. Most likely will be the last episode for 2023. Let's hit that goal of 100 subscribers by the end of this year. You guys know what to do. Like this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Clips from this whole podcast, you can get it on our playlist, you can get it on TikTok, you can get it on Instagram. And you get the audio from this podcast on Spotify. All links are in the description. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Joey, for editing this podcast. Happy holidays, Merry Christmas, and I'll catch you in the new year. Take care.